In the spring of 2008, a man who would be dead within 3 years stood before the Arab League in Damascus and predicted his own funeral. He did not know it was his funeral he was predicting. His name was Muammar Gaddafi, and what he said into the microphone, slowly, was this: "The turn will come to each of you. What happened to Saddam awaits you too." The room, full of Arab presidents and kings, held its breath for a moment. And then Hosni Mubarak laughed. Bashar al-Assad laughed. This is the story of 4 rulers in the Middle East who built personalist police states to defy the American-led order, who watched each other fall, who learned the wrong lessons from each other's failures, and who failed anyway. Saddam Hussein had already fallen, pulled from a hole in the ground and hanged in Baghdad 2 years before that summit. 3 years after it, Gaddafi was dead in a concrete drainpipe outside Sirte. 16 years later, Bashar was on a Russian cargo plane to Moscow. 18 years later, the man watching it all from Tehran, Ali Khamenei, who said almost nothing in public about any of it, was killed in his own office on a Saturday morning. The same day of the week he had been crippled by a bomb 45 years earlier. 4 men, 4 fortresses, none of them held. Here is the story of how they failed. Saddam Hussein was born in a mud brick village outside Tikrit in 1937. By the time he was 20, he had joined the Ba'ath Party. By 22, he had taken part in a failed assassination of Iraq's prime minister. He fled to Egypt, returned to Iraq after the 1968 Ba'athist coup, and spent the next 11 years as the country's vice president, the deputy to an aging president named Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr, whose head he was patiently waiting to put on a wall. In July of 1979, he forced al-Bakr to resign. 6 days later, he held the meeting that would define the next quarter-century of Iraqi history. The room was Khuld Hall. The date was July 22, 1979, and Saddam, 42 years old, was at a podium chain-smoking a Cohiba cigar and dabbing his eye with a folded handkerchief. The men in the seats below were the inner circle of the Ba'ath Party, members of the Revolutionary Command Council, senior cabinet ministers, regional party leaders, the people who, in any normal system, could have checked his power. Saddam had a paper. On it were 68 names. As an aide read each one, the named man was led from his seat by 2 security officers and out of the hall. By the end of the afternoon, 22 of them had been shot. Many were shot by the surviving members of the Revolutionary Command Council themselves. Saddam handed them pistols and told them to do the killing. He called it binding in blood. Most of the men who survived that day died in the years that followed. What Saddam built afterward was real, and it was a paradox. Iraqi illiteracy fell from 52% to 20%. UNESCO gave him a prize for it. Iraqi women became 46% of the country's teachers and nearly 30% of its doctors, in a region where that was almost unheard of. Iraqi hospitals were among the best in the Arab world. And in the same decade, his security services kept 11 million pages of surveillance files now archived at Stanford. His Al-Anfal campaign killed an estimated 180,000 Iraqi Kurds. On a single March morning in 1988, in a Kurdish town called Halabja, his air force dropped sarin and mustard gas and killed 5,000 civilians in 5 hours. The literacy campaigns and the gas attacks were the same machine. He did not build a state with schools alongside torture chambers. He built one in which the schools and the torture chambers ran on the same paranoid energy. Through all of this, Saddam was Washington's man. The United States had been arming him since the start of the Iran-Iraq War in 1980. When the Iranian Revolution had just toppled the Shah, taken American hostages, and seemed poised to spread Shia Islamism across the Gulf. The Reagan administration removed Iraq from the state sponsors of terrorism list, restored diplomatic relations, sold him American satellite intelligence, French Mirage jets, and German precursors for the chemical weapons he eventually used at Halabja. Saddam was not a friend. He was a useful proxy in a larger Cold War contest. His misread came at the end of July 1990, when the American ambassador to Baghdad, April Glaspie, sat across a table from him and read a sentence from a cable. "The United States," she said, "has no opinion on inter-Arab border disputes." She meant Washington would not take sides over Iraq's oil pricing argument with Kuwait. Saddam took it as a green light. 8 days later, he invaded Kuwait. What Saddam had not understood was that the rules of his entire career, the unwritten arrangement that armed and protected him, had been a Cold War arrangement. They depended on the Soviet Union. By the time Glaspie read him that cable, the Berlin Wall had been down for 9 months, and the Soviet Union itself had 9 months left to live. The world that had made him a strategic asset was disappearing. The Americans no longer needed him to balance against Iran. They no longer needed him at all. The Americans rolled him back in 6 weeks. President Bush asked the Kurds and the Shia of Iraq to rise up against him, and they did. And General Schwarzkopf signed an order letting Saddam's army keep its helicopters for, the order said, administrative purposes. Those helicopters gunned the uprisings down, street by street, for 3 weeks. Bush did not intervene. Saddam survived another 12 years, through sanctions that killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children, through weapons inspections he obstructed and finally evicted, through the September 11th attacks, which had nothing to do with him, but which produced an American administration looking for an excuse. In March of 2003, the United States invaded Iraq on the pretext of weapons of mass destruction that did not exist. The Iraqi army collapsed in 3 weeks. The Iraqi state collapsed with it. Saddam vanished. For 9 months, he moved from safe house to safe house in his home province. On December 13, 2003, American Special Forces pulled him out of a spider hole in a farmyard outside Tikrit. He was dirty and bearded, and he held up a hand and said, "I am Saddam Hussein, President of Iraq. I want to negotiate." There was nothing left to negotiate. 3 years later, on a Sunni Eid morning, with the Shia guards around the gallows chanting another man's name at him, he was hanged. The video, recorded on a cell phone smuggled past the metal detectors, leaked within hours and traveled the world before lunch. He was the first head of a United Nations member state removed from power by foreign invasion since the Second World War. The video of his death was the first execution of a head of state ever broadcast to the global public on a phone. In Tehran, one man watched it on a television in his office. Ali Khamenei had been Iran's president for the entire 8 years of Saddam's war against him. He now sat in the supreme leader's chair, and he drew his first lesson: never let them come close enough to reach. In Tripoli, another man watched the same footage and drew the opposite conclusion. He thought the lesson was the other one. He thought cooperation was the answer. Muammar Gaddafi was 27 years old when he became the ruler of Libya. He never quite recovered from how easy it was. It was September 1st, 1969. King Idris, then in his late 70s, was in Turkey for medical treatment. Gaddafi was an army captain in Benghazi. He walked into a radio station with a few dozen free officers, all of them under 30, none of them important, seized the microphone and announced the monarchy had ended. The takeover took 2 hours and no one died. For the rest of his life, he carried the belief, written into him by that morning, that power could always be taken that cheaply. He never understood it could be lost that cheaply too. What he built across the next 42 years in Libya was, again, a paradox. By 2010, Libya's Human Development Index was the highest in Africa and 53rd in the world. Literacy went from 20% to 88%. He built the Great Man-Made River, the largest irrigation project in human history, and even today, after the war, after the chaos, after everything, those pipes still deliver 70% of Libya's fresh water. Women became conscripts, fighter pilots, Supreme Court judges, and in June of 1996, in Abu Salim prison in Tripoli, his security services executed 1,270 political prisoners in approximately 2 hours and buried them in unmarked trenches. 8 years earlier, on December 21, 1988, Libyan intelligence agents had put a bomb in the cargo hold of Pan American Flight 103 from London to New York. The plane exploded over the Scottish town of Lockerbie. 270 people died, most of them American college students coming home for Christmas. United Nations sanctions followed. Libya became a global pariah. For more than a decade, Gaddafi sat under those sanctions, watching his oil revenue shrink and his isolation deepen. By 2003, the math had changed. Sanctions had drained his economy. The September 11th attacks had set off an American war on terror that was eating his region. And in March of 2003, the same month, almost the same week, that American forces would pull Saddam from his spider hole, the United States invaded Iraq. Gaddafi watched the invasion of Iraq from Tripoli and did something none of his peers had ever done. He picked up the phone to London and to Washington, and he announced that he was surrendering. His nuclear program, such as it was boxed up in crates and shipped to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. His chemical stockpiles were declared. Tony Blair flew into the Libyan desert and shook his hand inside the Bedouin tent and called it a new beginning. Condoleezza Rice visited Tripoli for tea. The same Bedouin tent went up on Donald Trump's estate at Seven Springs in upstate New York for the United Nations General Assembly. The deal was, in his understanding, I will give you my weapons and you will let me live. He had 8 years. In February of 2011, the Arab Spring reached Benghazi. Gaddafi gave a speech from the balcony of a building NATO had bombed in 1986 and promised, alley by alley, house by house, zenga zenga, that he would hunt the rebels down. The Arab League turned against him. The United Nations passed Resolution 1973, authorizing intervention. NATO jets flew. On the 20th of October, his convoy was struck on the road outside Sirte, and he ran into a concrete drainage culvert under the highway and was pulled out by a crowd that recognized him. He was beaten. He was stabbed with a bayonet. He was shot. Hours later, in Kabul, the American Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, was handed a BlackBerry by an aide as a CBS camera was rolling. She looked at the screen, laughed, and said, "We came, we saw, he died." The tent did not save him. The deal did not save him. 23 years after the bomb over Lockerbie, he was dead on a Saturday. The first of the Saturdays this story will ask you to remember. In Tehran, the same man watched the same footage. He had been Iran's supreme leader for 22 years by then. After Saddam, he had drawn one lesson. After Gaddafi, he drew the second, and it was simpler, and it would define the rest of his life. Never disarm. Never negotiate. Never trust the West. In Damascus, a younger man watched as well and drew the opposite of Gaddafi's conclusion. He decided that fighting was the answer. Of the 4 men in this story, Bashar al-Assad is the only one who never wanted the job. He was an ophthalmologist in his late 20s, finishing a residency at London's Western Eye Hospital when his older brother Bassel, the one their father, Hafez al-Assad, had spent decades grooming as the heir, drove a Mercedes into a roundabout on the airport road outside Damascus in the fog at 130 kilometers an hour. No seatbelt. Dead at the scene. Bashar was on a plane back to Syria within 24 hours. 6 years later, when his father died, the Syrian parliament amended the constitution within hours, dropping the minimum age for the presidency from 40 to 34, Bashar's exact age, and held a referendum he won with 97% of the vote. He had inherited a state he had not been trained to run, and for a year, briefly, he tried to reform it. What followed was called the Damascus Spring. He released 600 political prisoners, he authorized private banks, and opened the Damascus Stock Exchange, and Syrian GDP climbed to $60 billion by 2010. Universities admitted record numbers of women, and at the same time, sometimes in the same week, his security services were rounding up the intellectuals who had signed the petitions his reforms had encouraged. The writer Riyad Saif, the economist Aref Dalila. The salons were closed by the autumn of 2001. The regime returned to the family business, rule by 4 overlapping intelligence services and by a cousin, Rami Makhlouf, who came to control roughly 60% of the Syrian economy from a glass tower in central Damascus. The reforms his father's old guard had refused to make never came. The rural Sunni Syrians his father had once kept inside the patronage network drifted out of it. The state still functioned. The constituencies the state used to keep had stopped feeling kept. In March of 2011, in the southern town of Daraa, 15 schoolboys between the ages of 10 and 15 sprayed a sentence on a wall.
إجاك الدور يا دكتور.
Your turn, doctor. They were arrested by the security services. Their fingernails were pulled out. When their fathers came to the governor's office to ask for their children, the governor, Bashar's first cousin, Atef Najib, told the fathers to forget those children and make new ones, and that if they didn't know how, to bring him their wives. By the end of that week, the entire province was in the streets. By the end of the month, so was most of the country. Bashar watched the video of Gaddafi being pulled from his drainpipe in October of that year, in his office in Damascus, on a flat-screen television. We know he watched it because he later said so. And in that moment, he made the inverse bet. Gaddafi had given them what they wanted and died for it. He would refuse. He would never disarm, never negotiate, never leave. He chose his father's playbook from 1982, when his father had razed the city of Hama and killed somewhere between 10 and 40,000 of its residents in a single week. Bashar's defense minister's son, Manaf Tlas, his own childhood friend, pushed for a different choice. He was overruled, and within a year he had defected. The Sunni officer class drained out of the army after him. The Alawite Sunni coalition his father had assembled and his cousin had hollowed out was gone. He survived 13 years longer than Gaddafi had, but only because two patrons kept him alive. In 2015, after Russia watched what NATO had done in Libya, Vladimir Putin told his inner circle, "I will not let that happen to the Assads." He sent jets, he sent contractors. The Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, who had built the Quds Force, sent Iran's Foreign Legion, Hezbollah from Lebanon over a land bridge through Iraq, Iraqi militias, Afghan Shia mercenaries. By 2016, they had retaken Aleppo. Syria froze in place. The patrons held. In January of 2020, Qasem Soleimani was killed by an American drone strike on a road outside Baghdad airport. Khamenei wept openly at his funeral, in the most public, emotional moment of his entire life. 2 million people lined the route to the cemetery. The architect of the whole regional axis, the man who had personally kept Bashar in power for 5 years, was gone. The system Soleimani had built kept working for another 4 years on his momentum. Then, in September of 2024, the Israelis turned Hezbollah's pagers into bombs, killed Hassan Nasrallah in his bunker a week later, and Russia, by then bleeding in Ukraine, had nothing left to send. In late November, a group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham came south from Idlib. 11 days later, they were in Damascus. Bashar told his own younger brother, Maher, by phone, that a counteroffensive was being prepared. He was lying. He was on a Russian Ilyushin 76 cargo plane that lost its transponder over Homs and reappeared in Moscow. He had survived. His patrons hadn't. In Tehran, the last of the four watched his last ally board a Russian plane on the evening news. He knew what came next. He did not have time to do anything about it. Ali Khamenei was never supposed to be supreme leader. He had spent 36 years in the chair anyway. He watched everyone else fail, and he built a fortress with one unguarded window. In June of 1989, when Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini died, the Iranian constitution required that his successor be a Marja-e-Taqlid, a grand Ayatollah, the highest rank in Shia jurisprudence. Khamenei was nowhere near that rank. He was a Hojat al-Islam, 2 ranks below, a competent administrator and a former president without the clerical standing the office required. In a leaked video that surfaced years later, you can hear him telling the assembly of experts that he did not qualify, that many of them would not accept his words as those of a leader. The man who pushed him through anyway was Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, the Speaker of Parliament, who calculated that an underqualified supreme leader would be easy to manage. The constitution was rewritten within weeks to lower the religious bar. Within a decade, Rafsanjani had been pushed to the margins of Iranian politics by the very supreme leader he had installed. What Khamenei built around himself across the next 36 years was the most strategic and systematic of the 4 fortresses in this story. Each wall you can trace to a specific failure he had watched. Against Saddam's fate, the failure of a state to defend itself from invasion, he built a forward defense by proxy: Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, Iraqi Shia militias inside the Iraqi state, Bashar al-Assad as a land bridge to Beirut, Soleimani's Quds Force as the connecting tissue. Against Gaddafi's fate, the failure of disarmament. He built nuclear ambiguity, enrichment to 20%, then 60%, always one step short of weaponization, always enough doubt that no one wanted to risk striking. Against the failure of regime change from inside, the threat that had eventually killed Bashar's regime, he turned to the IRGC. And through the IRGC, he built the construction conglomerate Khatam al-Anbiya. And through Khatam al-Anbiya, an economic state within the state that, by the 2020s, captured roughly 1 Iranian rial in every 3.
And like every machine in this series, his was a paradox, though not the kind he would have wanted credit for. The Iran of his 36 years produced extraordinary things, almost all of them in spite of him. Iranian scientists turned the Royan Institute in Tehran into one of the world's leading centers for stem cell research. Iranian women, against the explicit preferences of their government, earned the majority of the country's university degrees. Iranian engineers built one of the most sophisticated drone programs outside the great powers. None of it was Khamenei's doing. The regime took the credit when it suited him and tried to constrain it when it didn't, barring women from certain faculties, jailing the scientists who spoke out, exiling the dissidents who refused to leave quietly. And while Iranians were achieving all of that, the fortress consumed everything around it. The rial collapsed. Hospitals stopped getting parts. 57% of Iranians reported being malnourished. 180,000 educated Iranians left every year for Europe and Canada and the Gulf. In June of 2009, 2 million Iranians filled the streets of Tehran wearing green and demanding a more open political system. The IRGC and the Basij broke their bodies. In September of 2022, after a young woman named Mahsa Amini was beaten to death in custody for an improperly worn headscarf, the country rose again. And again, the Basij broke the bodies. He did not see, or he refused to see, that the legitimacy a state burns in those moments cannot be earned back. The cascade came in 15 months. It started on the 7th of October 2023, when Hamas crossed the Israeli border. The Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, did not respond the way Khamenei expected. The Israelis turned Hezbollah's pagers into bombs in September 2024 and killed Hassan Nasrallah a week later. They tracked down Hamas's leader, Yahya Sinwar, in a Rafah ruin a month after that. Iran and Israel exchanged direct missile salvos for the first time in their history. On the 8th of December 2024, Damascus fell. The fortress's outer walls, Hezbollah, Hamas, Assad, had all collapsed in 15 months. In June of 2025, Israel and the United States launched a 12-day air war against Iran, Operation Rising Lion. Some 30 senior Iranian generals were killed in the first 24 hours. American B-2s bombed the deep nuclear facilities at Fordo and Natanz. The war ended in a ceasefire after 12 days, with no formal settlement. And after that war, Khamenei did what made operational sense for a man who had spent his entire life surviving precisely this scenario. He went underground. He stayed in the deep Lavizan bunker for months. Public appearances stopped. The world, watching, assumed he would not come up. In January of 2026, the Iranian people rose. 2 days of clashes left an estimated tens of thousands dead. The Basij could not hold the bigger cities. Whatever was left of Khamenei's bargain with the Iranian people ended that week. The strike came on Saturday, February the 28th, 2026. The same day of the week as the bomb in 1981 that had paralyzed his right arm. The Iranian press was already calling it the Saturday curse. The CIA had been tracking his movement patterns for months. They knew he sometimes worked above ground at his Pasteur Street office in central Tehran, in daylight, when perhaps he felt safer than he did in the underground bunker. On the Saturday in question, with negotiations on the war's aftermath underway in Geneva, the Israeli and American intelligence services assumed he would not be in the office. They assumed there would be no strike opportunity during talks. He came up. The intelligence services did not assume, they confirmed. American Air Force B-2s and Israeli F-35Is took off from bases hundreds of miles apart and arrived together. The munitions came through the roof. He was 86 years old. His daughter Bashra, his granddaughter Zara, and his son-in-law Mesbah were killed beside him. 3 family members he had kept close to the center of power for decades, who became, in that moment, casualties of the choices he had made about whose lives to put next to his. The taboo against killing a sitting head of state, the one that had been broken in Baghdad 2 decades earlier when Saddam was hanged, had extended. He had built defenses against every threat he could imagine: invasion, sanctions, coups, internal collapse. He had not built a defense against a precision strike on his own office in peacetime, because he could not believe the world would do it. The world did it. Within 10 days, the IRGC moved to install his son, Mujtaba, in his chair. The Assembly of Experts confirmed it under pressure. For 47 years, the Islamic Republic had told its people that this was not a monarchy, that this was not Saudi Arabia, that this was not the Pahlavis. That claim ended on the day Mujtaba took the seat. What follows now is unfinished. Iran's 12-day war ended in a ceasefire, not a settlement. The negotiations Khamenei had blocked for a generation between Saudi Arabia and Israel have started again, though no deal has been signed. The rial sits today at roughly 1.75 million to the dollar. 57% of Iranians, in their own surveys, report being malnourished. 180,000 educated Iranians leave the country every year, and the number is rising. Gaddafi's deal killed him. Assad's fight cost him everything but his life. Khamenei's fortress consumed the country it was built to protect. Each of them rejected the American-led order. Each of them learned from the previous one's failure. Each of them built a wall against the threat that had killed the man before him, and was killed by the threat he had not imagined. 4 men built states designed to outlast them. None of those states outlasted them. What replaces them is not yet known. Sunni autocrats more comfortable with Washington. Saudi Emirati capital chasing influence into the vacuum. Sunni Islamist politics, like the one now governing in Damascus. American withdrawal, or a war with Iran that could still come, depending on the week. None of it is what any of these 4 men wanted. The Middle East they tried to build is not the Middle East that comes next. What that next Middle East will be, no one yet knows. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. There's another story like this one on the way. If it changed how you see any of these 4 men, leave a like. And in the comments, tell me which of them you think came closest to surviving.